So I am thrilled to introduce our next two guests who probably don't need much of an introduction at all, but I'm going to anyway. On my left here is Ari Melber, who is definitely a face that will be familiar to all of you. Ari is an Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's an attorney, and he's the host of The Beat with Ari Melber, 6 p.m. nightly on MSNBC. The Beat launched in 2017 and gets about 1.5 million viewers per night, which is the largest 6 p.m. audience in MSNBC's 22-year history. The Beat is now one of the most watched news shows on the internet, drawing 13 million additional online views per month. Ari is also an NBC...
That explains why you've never invited me.
You're dry, but important.
Show. Okay.
Ari is also an NBC legal analyst, MSNBC's chief legal correspondent for MSNBC, and he covers the Justice Department, the FBI, and the Supreme Court. He previously served as a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate, and his writing has been published in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico, and the Atlantic. Along with Jay, I've had the great pleasure of being a guest on Ari's show, and not only does he ask smart, tough questions, but he peppers his show with rap lyrics. And I gotta say, I kind of like it because it really challenges the notion that lawyers can't also be cool. So thank you for that. So thank you, Ari, for being here. I am also thrilled to welcome Jeh Johnson. And the main reason I am thrilled to welcome Jay to this conference is he so wonderfully represents exactly what CAPI embodies, a commitment to public service and public integrity. That's exactly what we're hoping to highlight at this conference. Secretary Johnson has had a tremendous legal career that has encompassed both private law practice and public service, including 3 Senate-confirmed presidential appointments. He is currently a partner at Paul Weiss, where he has been affiliated on and off since 1984. In his most recent public sector post, Secretary Johnson led the United States Department of Homeland Security from December 2013 to January 2017. In that role, he served as the public face of the United States government's Homeland Security mission, engaging with the press on numerous occasions, testifying before Congress 26 times. So today is going to be a real walk in the park compared to that. Secretary Johnson managed 230,000 employees in 22 different components and agencies, including the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the Transportation Security Administration, the Coast Guard, ICE, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Secret Service. Between 2009 and 2012, Secretary Johnson served as General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Defense, where he was a primary legal architect for the military's counterterrorism missions in the Obama administration, and was responsible for the prior legal approval for every military operation authorized by the President and the Secretary of Defense. He co-authored the 2010 report that paved the way for the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law by Congress. Between 1998 and 2001, Secretary Johnson served as General Counsel for the U.S. Air Force. He also served as Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 1989 to 1991, trying 12 cases before a jury and arguing 11 appeals in 3 years. I'm exhausted already. Many people have said wonderful things about Jeh Johnson, including the former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who wrote a book called Duty. And in that book, he called Jeh the finest lawyer I ever worked with in government, a straightforward, plain-speaking man of great integrity with common sense to burn and a good sense of humor. Secretary of Johnson has received numerous awards and acknowledgments, including 3 Department of Defense medals for distinguished public service, 9 honorary degrees. However, the degree that we are most proud of here today is his law degree from Columbia Law School. On a personal note, I was a young associate at Paul Weiss, and I just have to say, Jay's reputation as an amazing lawyer was only exceeded by his reputation for being a dedicated mentor. He spent so much time, and he was generous with both his time and advice to all the young attorneys and has mentored so many young associates. So thank you both for being here. It is a true honor for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Barrett, for that warm introduction, and to all of you for joining us. We're, I think, both honored to be here, and I have plenty of questions because I think there's so many interesting things to get into, but I wanted to give you the benefit of a government tradition of the opening statement,
Sure.
Casual as you want to make it, about given the themes of this conference and what is happening in American government and how our cities are battling so many different issues. What's on your mind? What are the questions you're asking? What should we be thinking about?
Thank you, Your Honor. First of all, it's nice to be back in this classroom that I occupied for so many hours 38, 39, 40 years ago. Absolutely terrified, not sitting in the seat to which I was assigned because I didn't want to be called on, along with one or two of my classmates who are present here today. I do have two thoughts, and Ari, thanks for being here and doing this, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot of ground. I have two thoughts. One, a shout out to our district attorney, who, in my judgment, I've known him now for a long time, is one of the finest and most conscientious public servants I know. Cyrus, please keep doing everything you're doing. You don't have to do it forever, but like your predecessor. But by the way, you know, I chaired the Judiciary Committee of the New York City Bar Association for 3 years. In that capacity, the Judiciary Committee of the City Bar reviews and approves every candidate or nominee for a judgeship. So in the course of 3 years, I interviewed before our committee 500 people who wanted to be judges in this city, federal, state, local. And we also covered U.S. attorneys and district attorneys, nominees for U.S. attorney, candidates for district attorney. So in 2001, I had the privilege and responsibility of interviewing his predecessor for a job, Mr. Morgenthau. Everyone called him Mr. Morgenthau. Even the judges called him Mr. Morgenthau. So Mr. Morgenthau came in for his interview before the Judiciary Committee, brought his writing sample, and at age 83 or whatever he was then, and I asked him, so Mr. Morgenthau, what are you doing to campaign for re-election? And he said, appearing before the Bar Association. And then I asked him the question that was on everyone's mind before the committee. So Mr. Morgenthau, let me ask you this. In the event that, for some reason, you do not finish your 4-year term, say you decide to seek higher office, hypothetically, do you have any plans about succession? And he looked at me and he said, I have some thoughts on that. And we moved on. He was approved and reelected. The other thing I'll say is I was being interviewed last night by Wolf Blitzer at one of your sister networks, and I got to my car on the roof of Port Authority at around 6:45. I turned on the car, I turned on the radio, the satellite radio, which is always on channel 118, MSNBC, and there, blaring through my speaker, is a very, very lively interview by Ari Melber of a Trump surrogate who is yet again, for the 100th time, trying to make the claim that family separation was something that began in the Obama administration, which a million fact checkers have put the lie to. And thank you for the very lively Q&A. And it was.
He also said they're building a virtual wall.
Correct.
It's a direct quote.
A virtual wall, right. Right. So anyway, please, let's launch right in.
Well, those are a few great thoughts to get us going. You mentioned the legal authorities, and Barrett does, that you were tasked with. And I think most people in this room and at this institution, you take the practice of law seriously, no matter how big or small the issue, and depending on the situation, the client, it's big at least to that person. It's a special role. But it's fair to say the magnitude that you operated with was much higher. I wonder if you could walk us through, both from your experience, how you did that, which I just think is interesting, about when and how the United States can use force and what legal limits there are. And if you would, touch on two major areas where the U.S. government decides when it has the power to act. One that you were directly involved in, I know, which was the authorization, the legal sign-off to execute the mission against bin Laden. And two, the question hanging over the Iran debate, which I saw some of your comments last night. There's much we don't know about the facts of the situation, so I don't really want to grill you on that. But at the legal level, walk us through how you would and how the United States is supposed to deal with the question of what can we do against Iran immediately, and what do we need to get legally if we want to do more? As you know, this administration, like the one you served in, something they have in common, has invoked the 9/11 authorization for a lot of countries, in this case Iran as well. If you want to just run through all of that.
Sure. Good question. First, let me begin with this. Before I took the job of General Counsel of the Department of Defense, I was warned that you're going to have to give the legal sign-off for a lot of drone strikes, basically, and targeted legal force. Nothing in this classroom can prepare any lawyer, nothing in private practice can prepare a lawyer for a moment when, I was confronted with this probably 6 weeks into the job, maybe 2 weeks into the job, when all of a sudden some military officers from special ops in the basement of the Pentagon come up for a visit, and they have the baseball card, which is a PowerPoint slide that has the military objective, the target, his known terrorist activities and affiliations, his last known location, the munitions we intend to use, and a collateral damage assessment. And they brought it to me and said, here. And I looked at it, and then I looked at my deputy, and I said, well, what does he want with me? And my deputy said, they're waiting for you to tell him that it's okay to kill him. And that is a very weighty responsibility. I took it very seriously, my 4 years in that office, to the point where I made a habit of watching the video of every drone strike I authorized. I gave the legal authorization to, because I wanted to be reminded constantly of the gravity of what it was I was giving a legal approval for, and I would learn something new every time I watched one of these operations.
Did you ever say no?
Yes, I said no from time to time, and I will tell you, saying no is harder than saying yes, because saying no is like stopping an 80-mile-an-hour 100-car freight train that is barreling down the track because there's some really bad guy in some part of the world we want to kill. And the legal analysis is essentially twofold. One, implicit in all of that, every military operation, every use of lethal force by the military has to be consistent with the laws of armed conflict. That's underlying all of it. But I would, and encourage the lawyers working for me, to look at essentially two questions. One, is there international legal authority for this operation, and is there domestic legal authority for this operation? Two questions. International legal authority exists when you have host nation consent for the operation, where the host nation consents, yes, come into my country and conduct this operation, or there's a UN Security Council resolution authorizing use of force, or, and this is the most controversial one, and this is the one we relied upon for bin Laden, an act of self-defense if the host nation is unwilling or unable to deal with the threat in its territory itself. It's a doctrine, it's a basis that does exist. The exact contours of it can be a little sketchy. Then when it comes to domestic law, President Obama strongly preferred statutory authorization over reliance upon his inherent Article II constitutional authority to conduct a military operation. And so the test for those 4 years for me was the 2001 AUMF, which was passed by Congress 1 week after 9/11 and essentially authorized the president and our military to go after the planners, organizers of the 9/11 attack and those who harbored them, i.e. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces. And so for 4 years, I would want to assure myself that whoever the military objective was, or whatever group it was part of those two groups or an associated force. And we made it work with respect to core Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which exists in Yemen, which you could consider part of AQ or an associated force, and the Al-Qaeda affiliated elements of Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa. That's how we made it work. Now, subsequent to that, there have been arguments and legal conclusions made, which frankly I disagree with, that the 2001 AUMF somehow applies to ISIS. And this week, to my surprise, the administration seems to be making the argument that the 2001 AUMF somehow authorizes going against the regime in Iran, which to me is a real stretch. And when you're an executive branch lawyer, you're not in the business of simply coming up with arguments. You have to make the best legal judgment. And so what I said last night was, I don't think the 2001 AUMF fits any military operation against Iran, the government of Iran. But in my judgment, the president does have Article 2 constitutional authority to conduct a military operation in response to the attack on our drone. That is a matter of legal interpretation. It frankly has, that the scope of that has expanded, and it expanded during our administration. There's an opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel that was authored in 2011, Caroline Crass, who was the acting head, that basically says, President has, and this was in the run-up to the Libya operation, President has constitutional authority to deploy the armed forces in the event there are national interest at stake, national interest. And that's a pretty broad term. And in that case, the national interest were addressing regional instability in some part of the world. There's regional instability in some part of the world all the time. And supporting the UN Security Council, because the UN Security Council had authorized going against Libya. So given the scope of that opinion, and we saw the night of the strike on the chemical weapons facility in Syria, Jim Mattis invoking the words national interest. So the administration, the Trump administration, was invoking that for the strike in Syria. The same authority almost certainly exists for some sort of proportional strike in against Iran for shooting down our drone. And in fact, I think the domestic legal case for going against Iran is probably stronger than going against the chemical weapons facilities in Syria. The international legal basis for our military going after the regime, I think is harder. Would probably have to be some form of self-defense. But that's the type of analysis that national security lawyers should be going through.
And the House of Representatives voted this week to limit the authorities under the 9/11 authorization. Is that a good
Correct.
idea?
Well, as long as it's not just repeal, it's got to be repeal and replace. I do believe as a...
That applies to healthcare and war, then?
Yes. I do believe that...
Grim legal joke.
As a political matter, our Congress needs to get back into the business of authorizing war, rather than just step back and...
But what does that actually look like? Because on the one hand, there are many people who view the powers that grew under Bush and Obama in the hands of Donald Trump as quite scary to many people.
Yes.
And yet it's a reality, even in a world that, in a country that is, has a lot of resistance to Donald Trump, it's a reality that in many ways, so far, he has been more restrained than his predecessors, I would say Obama included, although they're different.
That's not because the lawyers are restraining him, it's his own...
Right,
that's
his policy, and you can also argue, obviously, as you get farther away from 9/11, some of the risks, terrorism and drone-oriented attacks may also change, so maybe the threat matrix as well. But what does it look like, in your view, to really do that? Does that involve the Congress sitting down, taking out maps, and saying, this authorization should go to these countries and not the other?
That's a very good question, because in my judgment, the terrorist threat has become much more amorphous. It's not cabined as much as it was in the period right after 9/11. You could have very interesting debates about what an armed force authorization should look like. One thing it should not be is sort of a worldwide, endless authorization to deploy lethal force anywhere in the world if we see a terrorist threat. It should not be a substitute for law enforcement, for criminal justice, and I think as a matter of laws of armed conflict, there has to be some definition of the non-state terrorist group for which the military is authorized to go against. So you have to, I really think you have to spell that out. And so simply repealing the AUMF is not the answer. I think there should be some form of authorization to go against ISIS specifically, and perhaps other groups that are a direct threat to the United States. But I think you have to be specific in that way. And it's been unfortunate that our Congress cannot seem to get its arms around authorizing what our military is deployed to do. I think Congress should take ownership of its responsibility in this regard and not simply leave it to executive branch lawyers to come up with legal theories to try to jam a whole lot into the 2001 AUMF.
Very interesting. I want to turn us to immigration, an area you know a lot about and that everyone's well aware is one of the defining political and policy controversies of our age. And I'll start with a very short story. During the 2016 campaign, I was out on the road early in the Republican primary, and I was in New Hampshire for a Donald Trump rally. And he hadn't won a single state yet, but he was clearly surging. There was a lot of grassroots energy. I didn't know that he would win the nomination or the presidency, but as reporters do or are supposed to, and as lawyers do, I'd already done my reading on New Hampshire, which was a state that had all kinds of problems, as you know, in employment and opioids, but is not, and this may or may not be a shock, but is not a high immigration state, New Hampshire. There's not a ton of immigrants there.
Right.
Indeed, if you
even per capita.
Yeah, and if you take it by country of origin, not that that's the only way to look at it, but it is the way that that candidate was looking at it. Mexican, South American, Hispanic immigrants were under 4% in New Hampshire. And Donald Trump got on the stage and just hammered immigration. And I looked out over this crowd that was overwhelmingly white, but also didn't look, I've been around a lot of political events, as you have, and I'm sure many of you have. So you get it, there's just different profiles. I know what a Dem and a GOP event look like. I know what a Green Party event looks like in my hometown of Seattle. I know what certain civil rights events look like. I've been in a lot of conservative events. I know what a Federalist Society event. I looked around. This did not look like a normal Republican Party event in terms of the people there, but it was overwhelmingly white. And he's hammering immigration. And then he said, and I heard there's a huge opioid problem right here in New Hampshire. And the room got much quieter, and it was sort of somber. And he said, and I heard there's people that your children are getting taken advantage of. They're getting sick. Some of them are dying on these opioids. And it's sort of like this moment. And I almost felt a little bit of an empathic or faux reality TV version of empathic side from him. And he says, this is terrible. And it makes me so sad. These are your children. And there's a hush over the room. And I thought, well, where's he going with this? And he said, when we close this border, that ends for New Hampshire. And it was, and I thought, looking around the room, I mean, sure, not all these things are factual, but everyone in here knows, because if your kid's, scoring domestic pharmaceuticals and doing them with, I hate to say it, but with other white kids in New Hampshire, where's the matrix there? And so I tee that up to you on the energy and the politics, and also as partly the discrimination of all this, because on the one hand, there are very real migration challenges for the United States, lawful and unlawful, including what you've already characterized publicly as a, quote, crisis. The new UN numbers out this week tell us the 70 million displaced persons and refugees in the world are at World War II levels. The majority of them are children. So we have a huge global crisis. But when you look at the top 10 countries that are, as you know, that have refugee populations, the United States is not in the top 10.
That was part of your debate last night.
I don't just say this. I say this to everyone. But yeah, I asked the Mark Lauder, the head of the Trump campaign's communications for 2020. I said, "Do you know? Are we in the top 5?" And he said, "I don't know." I said, "Do you think we're in the top 10?" He said, "I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" Sort of like, okay,
I'm not sure I can tell you. I know it's not top 10.
But as you know, it's not top 10.
Top 20.
Which goes to the long windup of this question to tee up our immigration section, which is on the one hand, there's all this real stuff, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's all of this confusion, demagoguery, emotional displacement, if you want to call it that. Yep. What do you see today, given your deep knowledge, and as Barry walked us through the organizations in the government you ran? How do you view this problem? What level is it at? And how do you separate the real crises around it from what has become a highly polarized and at times discriminatory conversation and part of American politics?
Wow. Okay. So let me begin by saying this topic, this issue, is the most difficult issue I've had to grapple with in public life. And I've had, as
Many.
the prior discussion reveals, some difficult issues to grapple with. Guantanamo Bay, military commissions, don't ask, don't tell, cybersecurity, the Secret Service, TSA, and immigration is the most difficult issue, not because there are no answers. Sometimes with difficult issues, there are no good answers. There are solutions and answers to the immigration problem, but because the issue is so politicized and migrants are so demonized and villainized, and because there is so much misinformation around the issue, it is impossible to get anything done. And to get anything meaningful done for immigration reform, you have to have acts of Congress, and to have acts of Congress, you have to have a bipartisan support for it. That's overarching thought number one. Overarching thought number two, not enough people are making this point. As you point out, as you noted, immigration was Donald Trump's number one campaign issue. That was the central theme of his campaign. And if you look at the numbers and you look at his performance in office on this issue, he likes to give himself A's. He gets an F on his number one issue because apprehensions on our southern border, as we speak, are the highest they have been in years. They are higher by multiples of anything that we saw on my watch. The highest single month on my watch was May 2014, 66,000 apprehensions. That was during the spike in 2014. Last month on our southern border, and this has been a problem Donald Trump's owned for 2.5 years. You can't blame the Obama administration. It was 144,000 apprehensions. April was 100,000, March was 100,000. And to give you a sense of how overly politicized it is and how polarized people are, we can't even work on a common set of facts or vocabulary in talking about the problem. So I was on MSNBC in late March, and I said, I know what 60,000 a month looks like, because that's what I live with, and I know what over 1,000 apprehensions a day looks like, but I cannot begin to imagine what 4,000 in a day and 100,000 a month looks like. This is truly a crisis, quote unquote. And that one quote went viral in right-wing media. The Daily Caller, the Washington Times.
Is this like Taylor Swift viral or more like Breitbart viral?
It was Breitbart viral.
Okay.
And I was on Fox the next day. I believe in working both sides of the street, literally. And when I went over to Fox for an interview, oh, thank you for what you said. Thank you so much. I said, what did I say? You said it was a crisis. No Democrat will acknowledge it's a crisis. They say it's a manufactured crisis. I said, well, a flood is a flood, a hurricane's a hurricane, this is a crisis. But very few people on the right are willing to listen to what the solutions are. And I owned this problem for 3 years and got some lessons learned from it. And the big lesson learned from managing border security for 3 years is that, and I actually began to learn this from my Republican predecessor, Mike Chertoff. I asked his advice during the spike in 2014. I brought him and his team in and said, Mike, how did you deal with this in the past? And he said, illegal immigration is a market-sensitive phenomenon. It reacts sharply to information in the information marketplace, very often put out by the smugglers, to perceived or real changes in enforcement policy in the U.S., as the Border Patrol and ICE like to refer to as consequence delivery. So in 2014, we ramped up our enforcement policy. We expanded our detention capability, which was controversial, and we got the Mexican government to help us on their southern border. And the numbers dropped off sharply, quickly.
Well, and this
point where,
is
let me just finish.
Well, I'm going to press you, but I'm going to press you because it's right in that point, just as I pressed Mr. Lauder last night.
Sure.
What your critics would argue is that was the blueprint that overlaps, that what's being done now is on a different scale, and it is at times sold as explicitly discriminatory, which your policies never were. But the blueprint in terms of increasing deportations to send a message to South America, being what many critics at the time, even before Trump, called punitive towards those people and families coming over, and using, for example, a military base that was formerly used for Japanese-American internment. All of those things, not at the scale of today, but in the blueprint, your critics say is a foundation that they are building on. Now I'll let you respond to that.
Well, expanding your capabilities, expanding enforcement in the face of an increase in illegal migration is not new. That is not new. HHS specifically used facilities on military bases in Texas for the kids, the unaccompanied kids. That was a new phenomenon. And under the law, the TVPRA, when an unaccompanied minor enters the United States, DHS has to give that child over to HHS within 48 hours, and then it becomes the responsibility of HHS to find proper placement.
Now, I'm only going to interject because you're going full acronym.
Sorry.
So TVPA is the Center...
TVPRA.
TVPRA, which is the Center Feinstein Amendment that people say, many people believe, was supposed to be humanitarian in its thrust, because you don't just send these kids back through Mexico to go all the way back to Central America. But the flip side that you're responding to is then other people look at America and say, but wait a minute, okay, but now you're housing all these kids at a military base.
Well, the TVPRA is humanitarian in nature because it prevents the U.S. government from simply shipping an unaccompanied child back to Central America without due process. And so legally, within 48 hours, DHS has to give the child to HHS, and HHS finds placement for the child in the best interest of the child. At least that's what they're supposed to do. HHS has to take time to find a relative or somebody somewhere in the United States to take the child, and they have to have a place to put the children in the meantime. And when you have a spike, if you're equipped to deal with X, and then you all of a sudden are faced with X times 4, we had to look for all kinds of places to keep these kids, including facilities on military bases, until they could be placed with a grandmother, an aunt, or somewhere in the United States. You can't just leave them at the bus station. Now, is that optimal? Of course not. It's not optimal. But expanding your capabilities and having detention levels go up, go down, depending upon migration patterns is not new. And in 2014, we saw a very sharp and significant rise, not nearly the numbers we're seeing now, and we had to expand our detention capability. Now, having said that, a minority of people who cross our border and are apprehended wind up in detention. And most often, if they are detained, it's somewhere as a matter of days. Most people they spend 2 or 3 days at a Border Patrol station. They're processed. There's an assessment made of risk of flight, and then they're brought to the nearest bus station with a notice to appear at a deportation proceeding. And that is what happens to the overwhelming majority of people. And that's also what's happening now, specifically given the numbers, because there's only so much detention space that exists right now. But the corollary to all of this is we saw this sharp drop-off in 2014 after we took action, and the numbers stayed low. They were the second, 2015 was the second lowest number since 1972, and then it started to creep up again. So the corollary lesson learned is as long as the push factors persist in Central America, the poverty and the violence, and now on top of that, the drought, which is decimating the coffee market in Central America, as long as the underlying push factors exist, the patterns will always revert back to their longer-term trends. And so when Trump got in office in 2017, the numbers did this again, owing really to his rhetoric from the campaign, and now he's the president. So the numbers dropped off sharply, and then they started to creep up again, and they're now to a point where they're at unprecedented levels.
But you think that his message had a temporary
Correct.
dampening of people actually choosing whether or not to make
right.
this
I mean,
trip.
they tore up my executive actions, my policy to prioritize deporting criminals. They tore all that up and said everybody's fair game. But they hadn't hired a single additional Border Patrol agent or built a single additional mile of wall. It was really his rhetoric, and so
his critics would say, well, that's not sustainable and not responsible. His supporters would say, well, if Jeh Johnson says that we bought X amount of time, 6 months or 18, from rhetoric alone, that's a pretty powerful example of Trump willing the worldview into view.
Except that
into being.
It only works for a short period of time. And now the smugglers and families in Central America have made the judgment, notwithstanding the fact that the President of the United States is Donald Trump, I'm gonna make it to the United States anyway.
Yeah.
So because the underlying conditions continue in Central America. So you have to address the push factors, which is why I think the Alliance for Prosperity is so important. We started that investment in 2016 with what was really a drop in the bucket, $750 million appropriated by Congress, and the numbers have been going in the wrong direction. But if you ask anybody in DHS or CBP who understands the nature of the problem, they will tell you that the money that we had begun to invest was already beginning to make a difference.
Right.
Suspending aid is the exact wrong answer and may be exacerbating the problem. Because when you say, I'm suspending aid to Central America and I might shut the border down, that adds to the sense of hopelessness and anxiety, which is probably contributing to the numbers we're seeing today.
Right. In the short time we have left, I'd like to do something that we do on the show with presidential candidates. You're not running this cycle, is that correct?
I'm one of the few Democrats who show up on MSNBC who is not running for anything.
But would you consider being a running mate or serving in a future administration?
I'm retired from public life.
Retired.
Retired from public life.
Because you're
I like showing up doing things like this.
Because you're very sought after. Well, then this will be even easier. So when we do the lightning round, have you ever heard one of these when I do these with the candidates?
Try me.
Basically, if you can give an answer in a sentence or less, that's the goal. So we'll whip through in our final 4 minutes here.
Yes, sir.
A few things.
Yes. Can't wait.
My proudest moment in public service was?
May 1, 2011 at 3:23 p.m.
Which was?
When I heard over the radio, Geronimo, we got bin Laden. My saddest day as an American was 9/11, which happens to be my birthday. My proudest day as a public servant was May 1, 2011.
We refined Don't Ask, Don't Tell and succeeded because?
Robert Gates. Robert Gates believed strongly that in that instance we needed to be methodical, careful. We had to commission this is more than a sentence. We had to commission a 10-month working group, which I and General Carter Ham led, to study the issue, have a conversation with the entire U.S. military, and then we'll consider it. And that's how we did it. And Congress was fine with that. Congress voted repeal based on the strength of that report. It was also an idea whose time had come in the military. The military was allowed to exist in a 1993 mindset for 17 years, and nobody had really challenged them on their thinking. And we did, just in the course of the study.
Barack Obama's greatest strength as president was?
He is the eminently reasonable man. I'm addressing your question from the standpoint of being an advisor, a cabinet officer. You go into any meeting with Barack Obama with the immense responsibility he had and the authorities he had to exercise. You knew you were meeting with a very intelligent, thoughtful, knowledgeable, reasonable human being. And though he didn't agree with everything I recommended, I never walked out of a meeting with Barack Obama feeling like, gee, we really got this wrong. Very often, he took it to a higher level, and it was an even smarter recommendation or solution that I had even conjured up. And so he didn't have, when he came to office in 2009, a wealth of experience in the executive branch. He had no experience in the executive branch. He had never been in national security. He had been a senator for 4 years. But, and this is why there are no litmus tests for president, he knew what he didn't know. He had very good advisors around him, and he knew how to listen and reach reasoned, strong judgments after getting the best advice from his people.
And his greatest area for improvement would be?
Greatest area for improvement. How about this? Is not Joe Biden.
Not super chatty, not a chatty Cathy type.
Yeah.
And Biden's greatest strength?
That he's Joe Biden. His Joe Biden's greatest strength is, I know where this is going next. Joe Biden's greatest strength is he loves...
I'm in the media, I'm predictable.
Joe Biden, Leon Panetta, Bill Clinton have one thing in common. They love people.
Right.
Human interaction is their oxygen. They can't get enough of it. They can't stop. I once spent a day with Joe Biden, which was an extraordinary experience. We went down to Guatemala for the inauguration of the new president, and on the way back, it was a 5 or 6 hour flight. I learned everything there is to learn about the 1972 Delaware Senate race. Meanwhile, his own staff, they're sitting there because they've heard it all before 20 times. But he
and
just
greatest
loves
area for improvement?
I think the recent comment about Herman Talmadge and James Eastland, I know what he meant, and I know the point he was trying to make, which I think is an important point to make. I think it is indispensable for our president to have the ability to work across the aisle, to work with people who have different views from themselves in order to get stuff done. I believe that strongly about public service. He picked bad examples, and he risked. It wasn't so much that it was racially insensitive. I think with comments like that, talking about the glorious days when James Eastland was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he risked, in a world where voters want the iPhone 10, he's going to look like, the flip top cell phone. So he's got to be careful. He's got to look. Did
he minimize the moral dimension of why so many people don't think that was a high water mark?
Yeah, he did, and he's in the sense that it was a comment insensitive to the current state of our politics in 2019 in the cycle of a primary campaign?
A couple more and then we're done. The scariest thing you learned about Ebola was?
You know, that's interesting. The scariest thing about any lethal virus is you don't know where it's going to stop. You don't know how far it's going to spread. And you'll recall in the fall of 2014, there was a lot of panic about the spread of it in Dallas, Texas, at the hospital. And then somehow the public got over it. And there was someone infected with the Ebola virus here in New York who rode the New York City subways. And New Yorkers, being New Yorkers, are like, okay, yeah, what else you got for me? You know, and everybody kind of calmed down. But there was a while where every time a passenger on a commercial flight bound for the United States got sick in the restroom of the plane, that became a matter for the Secretary of Homeland Security to personally address. And we were all freaked out. And this is a comment I want to make about the prior administration. During the depths of that crisis, there was a school of thought that we should suspend visas from the 3 affected countries and suspend travel. And as the Homeland Security guy, I kind of bought into that thinking. You know, when you're the Homeland Security guy, you want to buy down the risk. You want to minimize the risk to the homeland and everybody in it. And so one of the ways you minimize the risk of the spread of Ebola is suspend travel from those countries so somebody doesn't walk into the country with the virus. And Samantha Power convinced me, 2 things convinced me that there was not the best course. One was I looked at the list of the countries that had suspended travel, and I looked at the list of the countries that had not, and it occurred to me, the United States of America belongs in this list, not that list. And if we go to this list, all these other countries are going to follow us, and we need to lead. And it was Samantha who said that if we go that route, we're going to isolate these 3 countries at a time when they need us the most. And that's not what we're about. And she was right. And as you know, the United States led. We sent our military to this part of the world, to West Africa, and we sent our health community, and we beat back the virus.
My final lightning round question for you.
That wasn't a lightning round answer, sorry.
Well, your inner council bureaucrat, it might be showing.
Yes.
But I think the details you offer are very interesting to those of us who are here. The final lightning round question is the most nebulous and potentially the scariest, so I like to end, in that space.
Okay.
Given everything you've seen, including some of the things that you still can't talk about in the nature of the roles you've had in government classification rules, at a broader level, the likelihood of the United States facing a cyber attack in the next decade that is worse than anything we've experienced, or more destabilizing than what we've been through, that likelihood, in your view, is how high?
More likely than not.
There you go. I hope you all have a great day. Please join me in thanking Secretary Jeh Johnson.